The blood on her white dress looked like spilled wine in the ballroom's golden light. Kim pressed her trembling fingers against the cello strings, watching the man in the black suit shield her body with his own as bullets shattered the crystal chandelier above them. 3 hours earlier, she had been nothing more than a musician hired to perform at Seoul's most exclusive charity gala. Now she was somehow connected to the most dangerous man in the city, and everything she thought she knew about her quiet, peaceful life was crumbling like the plaster raining down from the ornate ceiling. The evening had begun with such promise. Arrived at the Grand Palazzo Hotel carrying her beloved cello in its weathered case, the same instrument her grandmother had played in the Seoul Philharmonic 40 years ago. The ballroom buzzed with the energy of Korea's elite, politicians and business leaders mingling beneath towering arrangements of white orchids and baby's breath. Her performance was scheduled for 9 o'clock, right after the auction for the Children's Hospital Foundation. She had performed at dozens of similar events over the past 3 years, ever since graduating from the Seoul National University College of Music. These gigs paid well enough to cover her tiny studio apartment and modest living expenses while she auditioned for permanent orchestra positions. Tonight's fee would cover her rent for 2 months, a blessing she couldn't afford to refuse even though something about the guest list made her uncomfortable. From her position near the small stage, Aaron noticed him immediately. While other guests laughed and socialized over champagne and hors d'oeuvres, one man sat alone at a table in the shadows, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He was perhaps 35, with sharp features and perfectly styled black hair. His expensive suit couldn't hide the controlled violence in his posture, the way he held himself like a predator ready to strike. I wonder where all of you are watching from tonight, Era thought as she tuned her cello, imagining faces around the world who might understand how music could transport you beyond your circumstances. Have you ever felt that moment when a melody reaches into your soul and changes everything? The way it did for my grandmother when she first heard Dvorak's cello concerto? Music has this power to connect us across any distance, any difference. When the auction ended and the master of ceremonies introduced her, Era took her position center stage and began the hauntingly beautiful opening notes of Bach's Suite No. 1 in G major. The familiar melody flowed from her fingers like water, each note pure and clear in the suddenly hushed ballroom. She closed her eyes and lost herself in the music the way she always did, letting the cello sing the emotions she could never express in words. That was when she noticed him again, the mysterious man in the shadows. His entire body had gone completely still, his hands gripping the edge of his table so tightly his knuckles showed white. Something in her music was affecting him powerfully, and she found herself playing directly to him, pouring her heart into every phrase as if the melody could bridge the impossible distance between their worlds. She was halfway through the second movement when the first gunshot rang out. The sound cracked through the ballroom like thunder, instantly transforming the elegant gathering into chaos. Women screamed, and men shouted as people dove under tables and scrambled toward exits. More shots followed, automatic weapons fire that shattered windows and sent chunks of marble flying from the walls. Era froze on stage, her bow suspended above the strings as terror paralyzed her completely. She could see men in black tactical gear streaming through the main entrance, their faces hidden behind masks as they sprayed bullets indiscriminately into the crowd. The beautiful white dress she had saved for months to buy was suddenly the most visible target in the room. That was when he moved. The mysterious man from the shadows crossed the ballroom in seconds, moving with deadly grace through the chaos as bullets whistled around him. Before Era could process what was happening, he had reached the stage and pulled her down behind the grand piano, his body forming a protective barrier between her and the gunfire. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and calm despite the violence erupting around them. His accent was cultured, educated, but underneath she heard something cold and dangerous that sent chills down her spine. "Stay close to me, and you'll live through this." "Who are you?" she whispered, clutching her cello case against her chest like armor. "Why are you helping me?" "Because your music reminded me of someone I lost," he replied, and for just a moment his hard expression softened with something that looked like grief. "Because beauty like yours shouldn't be destroyed by animals like these." Another burst of gunfire shattered what remained of the chandelier, sending crystal cascading down around them in a deadly rain. The man pulled Era closer, his arms strong and sure as he shielded her from the falling debris. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. "My name is Dante Moretti," he said as he drew a sleek black pistol from inside his jacket. "And after tonight, your life will never be the same." Before Era could ask what he meant, Dante rose from their shelter and returned fire with lethal precision. She watched in horrified fascination as he moved like a trained killer, each shot finding its target with cold efficiency. Within minutes, the attacking force was either dead or retreating, leaving behind a ballroom that looked like a war zone. When the shooting stopped, Dante turned back to Era with blood on his white shirt and violence still burning in his dark eyes. The transformation was complete. The man who had listened to her music with such vulnerable intensity was gone, replaced by someone who belonged to a world of shadows and death. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand to help her up. It wasn't a request. Era stared at his outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would change everything. Behind him, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. Around them, survivors moaned and called for help among the wreckage of what had been Seoul's social event of the season. Her cello case was cracked but intact, the precious instrument inside somehow unharmed despite the chaos. Just like her, it had survived something violent and terrifying that should have destroyed it completely. She took Dante's hand. The moment their fingers touched, Era felt electricity shoot through her entire body, a connection that had nothing to do with the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. This dangerous stranger had risked his life to protect hers, had killed multiple men to keep her safe, and now he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "We need to leave before the authorities arrive," Dante said as he helped her to her feet. His grip was firm but gentle, and she noticed he was careful not to let her see the bodies of the men he had killed. "Trust me, Era Kim. I know who you are, and I know they'll be back for you." "How do you know my name?" she asked, but Dante was already leading her toward a service exit, moving with the confidence of someone who had escaped from crime scenes before. "Because I've been watching you for months," he replied, and the admission sent another chill through her already shaken world. "Because your music called to something I thought was dead inside me." As they stepped into the cool Seoul night, Era caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hotel's glass doors. Her white dress was stained with blood, and her dark hair had come loose from its elegant updo. But her eyes held a new awareness that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. She was no longer just a struggling musician trying to make her way in the world. She was connected to Dante Moretti now, this mysterious man who killed with the same precision he brought to everything else. And despite the terror still racing through her veins, she felt more alive than she had in years. The black sedan waiting at the curb looked like something from a movie, all tinted windows and expensive lines. When Dante opened the passenger door for her, Era hesitated for just a moment, understanding that stepping inside would be crossing a line she could never uncross. Then she thought about the way he had looked at her while she played, the raw vulnerability in his eyes when her music reached something deep inside his guarded heart. She thought about how he had risked everything to protect a stranger, how his voice had carried genuine grief when he mentioned someone he had lost. Era got into the car. As they drove through Seoul's neon-lit streets, she cradled her cello case in her lap and watched the city lights blur past the window. Everything familiar was falling away behind them. Her small apartment and quiet routine and predictable life dissolving like a dream upon waking. "Where are we going?" she asked, but Dante didn't answer immediately. He was focused on the road, checking his mirrors constantly, as if expecting pursuit. "Somewhere safe," he finally said. "Somewhere I can explain what happened tonight and why your life depended on leaving with me." The blood on her white dress had dried to a dark rust color, a permanent reminder of the moment everything changed. Era closed her eyes and let herself remember the feeling of the music flowing through her fingers, the way the Bach had filled the ballroom with beauty right before violence shattered it completely. She had no idea what kind of world she was entering, but she knew there was no going back. Dante Moretti had claimed her the moment he stepped from the shadows to save her life, and now her story was bound to his in ways she was only beginning to understand. Era woke to the sound of classical music drifting through unfamiliar walls, something hauntingly beautiful that made her heart ache before she even opened her eyes. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft, covered in silk sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a room that belonged in a palace rather than anywhere she had ever been. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the memories crashed back like a physical blow. The gala, the gunfire, Dante Moretti pulling her behind the piano as bullets shattered crystal around them. The blood on her white dress and the way he had looked at her, as if she were something precious he couldn't bear to lose. Her cello case stood beside the bed, unharmed but somehow different in this opulent setting. Everything else about her old life seemed impossibly distant now, as if Seoul and her tiny apartment existed on another planet entirely. The music grew louder and she realized someone was playing violin somewhere in the house, a piece she didn't recognize, but that spoke of profound sadness and loss. Whoever was playing possessed exceptional skill, drawing emotion from the strings that made tears spring to her eyes without warning. Era rose from the bed and discovered she was wearing silk pajamas instead of her bloodstained dress, the fabric so fine it felt like water against her skin. Someone had undressed her while she slept, had cared for her with gentle hands while she was unconscious and vulnerable. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it sent warmth spreading through her chest. A soft knock at the door interrupted her confused thoughts. "Come in," she called, not knowing what else to do in this strange new world she had stumbled into. An elderly Korean woman entered carrying a silver tray laden with fresh fruit, delicate pastries, and steaming tea. Her gray hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her black uniform was perfectly pressed, but her eyes held a kindness that immediately put Era at ease. "Good morning, Miss Kim," the woman said with a slight bow. "My name is Mrs. Park. I hope you slept well despite the circumstances. Mr. Moretti asked me to see that you had everything you needed." "Where am I?" Era asked, accepting the tea gratefully. The first sip sent warmth flooding through her body, some expensive blend that tasted like flowers and sunlight. "You are at the Moretti estate, approximately 1 hour outside Seoul," Mrs. Park replied as she arranged the food on a small table by the windows. "You are perfectly safe here. Mr. Moretti's security is quite comprehensive." Era moved to the windows and gasped at the view beyond. The estate stretched across rolling hills covered in meticulously maintained gardens, with a lake in the distance that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Ancient pine trees lined curved pathways that led to smaller buildings scattered throughout the grounds, each one positioned for maximum beauty and privacy. "It's incredible," she breathed, trying to process the scale of wealth required to maintain such a place. "How long have I been here?" "Since last night," Mrs. Park said, but something in her voice made Era turn around. The older woman was studying her face with an expression of wonder mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "Is something wrong?" Era asked, suddenly self-conscious under the intense scrutiny. "Forgive me," Mrs. Park said quickly. "It's just that you look so much like her. The resemblance is quite remarkable." "Like who?" But Mrs. Park was already retreating toward the door, clearly having said more than she intended. "Mr. Moretti will answer your questions when you're ready. There are clothes in the wardrobe that should fit you perfectly. He has excellent judgment about such things." When the door closed behind her, Era opened the massive wardrobe to find an entire collection of designer clothing in exactly her size. Dresses, blouses, pants, shoes, even undergarments, all in styles that suited her perfectly. How could Dante possibly know her measurements and preferences so precisely? She selected a simple blue dress that felt appropriate for exploring this mysterious estate, then ventured into the hallway beyond her room. The house was even more magnificent than her brief glimpse had suggested, with soaring ceilings, marble floors, and artwork that belonged in museums. Fresh flowers filled enormous vases in every room, their perfume mixing with the lingering scent of the violin music that continued to drift from somewhere deeper in the house. Following the sound, Era found herself in a long corridor lined with oil paintings. She stopped dead when she realized what she was looking at. Every portrait was of the same woman, painted by different artists over what appeared to be several years. The woman was breathtakingly beautiful, with dark hair and delicate features. But what made Era's blood run cold was that the woman looked exactly like her. Not similar, not reminiscent. Exactly like her, as if she were staring into mirrors painted by master artists. Her name was Isabella, Dante's voice said behind her. So quiet, she almost didn't hear it over the violin music. She was my wife. Era spun around to find him standing in the doorway, still dressed in the black suit from the night before, though he had removed his tie and jacket. In the morning light, he looked younger somehow, less dangerous and more human, but the grief in his dark eyes was unmistakable. Era repeated, the word catching in her throat as she gestured at the portraits surrounding them. What happened to her? She was murdered 3 years ago, Dante said, moving to stand beside one of the paintings. Killed by my enemies to hurt me in the cruelest way possible. They knew that destroying her would destroy me more effectively than any bullet. The violin music stopped suddenly, leaving them in silence that felt heavy with unspoken pain. Era stared at the portrait closest to her, studying the woman's face that was so perfectly identical to her own it seemed impossible. Is that why you saved me last night? She asked. Because I look like her? Dante turned to meet her eyes, and she saw something vulnerable there. Something that made him seem almost fragile despite his obvious strength and power. Partly, he admitted. When I first saw you 3 months ago at the charity concert for Soul Children's Hospital, I thought I was seeing a ghost. I've been watching you ever since, trying to understand if fate was playing some cruel joke on me. You've been watching me for months, Era said, the words sending shivers down her spine. She remembered that performance clearly, how she had felt eyes on her throughout her solo, but had never been able to identify the source. I needed to know if you were real, Dante said. Isabella used to play violin to calm me when the rage threatened to consume everything. After she died, I couldn't bear to hear music anymore. It reminded me too much of what I had lost. But when you played that night, something in your cello reached past the walls I had built around my heart. The violin music started again, drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. Dante's entire body tensed at the sound, his hands clenching into fists as if he were fighting some internal battle. Who was playing? Era asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. No one, Dante said, his voice rough with emotion. It's a recording of Isabella's last performance, the night before she died. I have speakers installed throughout the house so I can hear her music wherever I go. It's the only way I can still feel connected to her. Era's heart broke for this man who had surrounded himself with ghosts, who had turned his beautiful home into a shrine to a love that death had stolen from him. The portraits weren't just artwork, they were desperate attempts to keep Isabella's memory alive in every corner of his world. She must have been extraordinary, Era said softly, studying another painting that showed Isabella laughing, her eyes bright with joy that made the resemblance between them even more startling. She saved me, Dante replied. I was born into this life of violence and death, raised to believe that power came from fear and respect came from brutality. Isabella taught me that there were other ways to live, other things worth protecting besides territory and reputation. What happened the night she died? Dante moved to the end of the corridor, where a final portrait showed Isabella in a flowing white dress, her violin held lovingly in her hands. The enemy family, the Rossellis, discovered that she was my weakness, he said. They kidnapped her and sent me a recording of her final violin performance. By the time I found her, she had been dead for hours. Era felt tears sting her eyes as she imagined the horror of that discovery, the way such a loss would shatter someone who had finally learned to love. No wonder Dante had surrounded himself with memories. No wonder he moved through the world like a man already dead inside. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words completely inadequate for such profound grief. For 3 years I've existed rather than lived. Dante continued, his voice barely audible. I buried my heart with Isabella and focused only on revenge and building my empire. Music became torture, beauty became pain, and I convinced myself that I preferred the emptiness. Until last night? Until I heard you play and remembered what it felt like to feel something other than rage, Dante said, turning to look at her again. Your music doesn't sound like Isabella's. Your technique is different, your interpretation more modern. But it reaches the same place inside me, touches something I thought was gone forever. Era moved closer to the portrait of Isabella with her violin, studying the painted face that was so perfectly identical to her own. The artist had captured something in Isabella's expression, a depth of love and contentment that spoke of a woman who had found her place in the world. "I'm not her," Era said quietly, the words hanging between them like a challenge. "I know that," Dante replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested the knowledge was more intellectual than emotional. "You're your own person, with your own dreams and talents and desires. But looking at you, listening to you play, it's like being offered a chance to live again instead of just existing." The violin recording reached a crescendo, Isabella's final performance filling the corridor with haunting beauty that made Era's chest tight with emotion. She could only imagine how it affected Dante to hear this every day, to be constantly reminded of what he had lost. "Where is her music room?" Era asked suddenly, the question surprising them both. Dante stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his features. "Why do you want to see it?" "Because if I'm going to understand you, if I'm going to understand what this all means, I need to see where she created her music," Era said. "I need to see the place where she made you feel alive." After a moment that stretched like eternity, Dante nodded and led her deeper into the house. The music room was at the very heart of the estate, a circular chamber with perfect acoustics and windows that looked out over the gardens. Isabella's violin still sat on its stand, untouched but lovingly maintained, surrounded by sheet music and a beautiful grand piano. "I haven't been in here since the day she died," Dante admitted, his voice thick with emotion as he stood in the doorway. "I couldn't bear to disturb anything she had touched." Era moved to where her cello case waited, somehow knowing that Mrs. Park had brought it here on Dante's instructions. She assembled her instrument with practiced movements, then took the chair that had clearly been placed for her across from Isabella's violin stand. "What are you doing?" Dante asked, but he stepped fully into the room for the first time in 3 years. "Something I should have done last night," Era replied as she positioned her bow. "Something that might help us both understand what this connection means." She began to play the piece she had been performing when the gunfire erupted, the Bach that had been interrupted by violence and chaos. But this time she played it the way she had always meant to, with all the emotion and passion that the beautiful music demanded. Dante sank into a chair across from her, his dark eyes never leaving her face as the cello sang its ancient song of love and loss and hope. For the first time since entering his world, Era felt completely herself, her music flowing pure and true in this sacred space that Isabella had created. When the final note faded into silence, Dante was crying. Not the angry tears of grief and rage, but something softer, something that spoke of healing beginning to take root in the darkness where his heart had been. "Thank you," he whispered, and Era knew that everything between them had changed in that moment. She wasn't just a reminder of his dead wife anymore. She was Era Kim, cellist and survivor, a woman strong enough to play music in the room where love had lived and died. The ghosts weren't gone, might never be completely gone, but they no longer held complete dominion over this beautiful, broken man who had risked everything to save her life. The nightly concerts began 3 days after Era's first performance in Isabella's music room. Every evening at 8 o'clock, she would take her position in the circular chamber while Dante sat in the same chair, listening with an intensity that made her feel like her music was physically reaching into his chest and mending something broken there. She played everything she knew by memory. Bach and Vivaldi, Elgar and Saint-Saëns, pieces that ranged from sorrowful to triumphant and back again. With each passing night, she watched the rigid tension in Dante's shoulders gradually soften, saw the harsh lines around his eyes slowly ease as her cello sang away years of accumulated pain. It was during her 4th evening performance that his men finally came to investigate what was happening to their boss. Era was halfway through a piece by 4 when she noticed figures gathering in the hallway beyond the music room's open door. 3 men in expensive suits watched from the shadows, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern as they observed their leader's transformation. "Don't stop playing," Dante said quietly when he noticed her distraction. "They need to see this. They need to understand that something is changing." After she finished the piece, Dante rose and beckoned the men into the room. "These are my most trusted advisors," he said to Era. "Lorenzo Benedetti, my lieutenant and oldest friend. Marcus Chun, who handles our financial operations. and Roberto Salvatore, head of security. Lorenzo was perhaps 50, with graying temples and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as he studied Era's face. Marcus appeared younger, maybe 40, with the sharp features of someone who calculated risks for a living. Roberto was built like a soldier, all controlled muscle and watchful alertness. But when he looked at Era, there was something almost protective in his expression. "Miss Kim," Lorenzo said with a slight bow. "We've heard remarkable things about your musical abilities, and about your effect on our friend here. Dante hasn't been the same since Isabella died," Marcus added, his tone matter-of-fact, but not unkind. "We've watched him become increasingly ruthless, increasingly isolated. Music was torture for him. Beauty was pain. But something has changed these past few days," Roberto observed, studying Dante's face with the keen attention of someone whose job was to notice everything. "He's sleeping better, eating regularly. Yesterday, he smiled at Mrs. Park when she brought him tea." "Music has always had power to heal," Era said carefully, unsure how much she should reveal about the growing connection between herself and their boss. "Sometimes it just takes time to find the right melody." "The right melody," Lorenzo repeated, something thoughtful in his voice. "Yes, I can see how that might be true." What Era didn't understand yet was the danger inherent in Dante's transformation. As the four men explained the reality of their world, she began to comprehend just how many enemies would view her presence as either opportunity or threat. "The Moretti family controls most of Seoul's waterfront," Lorenzo said as they moved to Dante's study after the music ended. "Import, export, shipping contracts, union negotiations. It's a multi-billion-dollar operation that employs thousands of people legitimately. But there are other aspects to the business," Marcus continued with diplomatic discretion. "Aspects that bring us into conflict with rival organizations who would like to see our influence diminished. 3 families in particular have been testing our boundaries since Isabella's death," Roberto said bluntly. "The Yamamoto clan from Osaka, the Kim syndicate here in Seoul, and the Volkov Bratva operating out of Vladivostok. They've been waiting for signs of weakness, for evidence that Dante's grief had made him vulnerable. And now they'll see my recovery as either a threat or an opportunity," Dante said, his arm moving protectively around Era's shoulders. "They'll either try to eliminate what they see as the source of my renewed strength, or they'll try to use Era against me the way the Rossellis used Isabella." The weight of this revelation settled over Era like ice water. Her presence wasn't just complicating Dante's personal life, it was potentially destabilizing an entire criminal empire. Every moment of happiness, every small step toward healing, was also increasing the danger to everyone around her. "I should leave," she said suddenly, the words surprising everyone including herself. "If my being here puts you at risk, puts Mrs. Park and your men at risk, then I should go back to my apartment and pretend none of this ever happened." The silence that followed was deafening. Dante's hand tightened on her shoulder while his 3 advisors exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of conversations they'd already had about this exact possibility. "It's too late for that," Roberto said finally, his voice gentle but implacable. "You were seen leaving the gala with Dante. Your apartment has been under surveillance by at least 2 different organizations since that night. Returning to your old life would be signing your death warrant." "Then what do we do?" Era asked, feeling trapped between impossible choices. "We protect you," Dante said simply. "We adapt our security protocols, we accelerate some business decisions we've been considering, and we make it clear to anyone watching that you are under the protection of the Moretti family." "And if that's not enough?" Lorenzo answered that question with a look that reminded Era exactly what kind of men she was now surrounded by. "Then we respond the way we always have to threats against our family," he said, with overwhelming force and absolute finality. Later that evening, after his advisors had left to implement new security measures, Dante showed Era a part of his estate she hadn't seen before. Hidden behind a bookshelf in the library was a room that took her breath away, not for its beauty, but for the intensity of obsession it represented. Every surface was covered with photographs, letters, concert programs, and personal belongings that had once belonged to Isabella. Her dresses hung in pristine condition, her jewelry was displayed in museum-quality cases, and her sheet music was organized chronologically from her first childhood lessons to her final performance. "This is where I come when the recordings aren't enough," Dante admitted, his voice thick with emotion as he touched a silk scarf that still held the faint scent of Isabella's perfume. When I need to remember every detail of her face, every word she ever spoke to me. Era walked slowly through the shrine, understanding now the true depth of Dante's devotion to his dead wife. This wasn't just grief, it was a complete inability to let go, a refusal to accept that love could die even when the beloved did. "How old were you when you met her?" Era asked, studying a photograph of Isabella laughing at what appeared to be a private party. 22, Dante replied. "I was angry, violent, convinced that the only way to survive in this world was to be more ruthless than everyone around me. My father had died in a territory war the year before, and I was trying to prove myself worthy of inheriting his empire. And she changed you? She saved me," Dante said, moving to stand beside a portrait that showed Isabella in her wedding dress. "I was becoming a monster, someone who solved every problem with brutality and intimidation. Isabella taught me that strength could be gentle, that real power came from protecting people rather than dominating them." Era picked up a piece of sheet music, recognizing the composition as something incredibly complex and emotionally demanding. Isabella had written notes in the margins, technical reminders mixed with personal observations about the emotional content of each phrase. "Play this for me," she said suddenly, extending the sheet music toward Dante. "I can't," he replied, backing away as if the paper might burn him. "I haven't touched a piano since the day she died. Music became too painful, too connected to everything I lost." "But you listen to her recordings every day," Era pointed out. "You surround yourself with her memory in every room of this house. Maybe it's time to participate in the music instead of just experiencing it as a spectator." Dante stared at the sheet music for a long moment, then slowly took it from her hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he moved to the piano bench that sat in one corner of the shrine room. "Isabella wrote this piece for me," he said as he positioned his hands over the keys. "She performed it for me on our wedding night, said it represented everything she felt but couldn't put into words." The first notes were hesitant, uncertain, but muscle memory gradually took over as Dante's fingers found their way across the keyboard. The melody that emerged was heartbreakingly beautiful, a love song that spoke of devotion so profound it transcended the physical world. Era assembled her cello and began to play along, finding harmonies that complemented Isabella's composition while adding her own interpretive voice to the music. Together, piano and cello created something that honored the past while acknowledging the present, that celebrated love without being trapped by it. When the final chord faded into silence, Dante was crying again, but these tears were different from the ones she'd seen before. They carried release instead of just pain, acceptance instead of just loss. "Thank you," he whispered, and before Era could respond, he was kissing her. His lips were soft against hers, tentative at first, but growing more confident as she responded to his touch. The kiss tasted like tears and music and 3 years of buried longing finally finding expression. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard, staring at each other with a mixture of desire and uncertainty. "Is this what you want?" Era asked, her voice barely audible in the shrine room, surrounded by memories of another woman's love. "I don't know what I want anymore," Dante replied honestly. "For 3 years I've known exactly who I was and what I was supposed to feel. But you've changed everything. You've made me remember what it's like to hope for something beyond mere survival." Era looked around the room filled with Isabella's belongings, understanding that she would always be sharing Dante with a ghost, always competing with a love that death had made perfect and untouchable. But she also saw something else in his face, something that suggested he was finally ready to live in the present instead of just existing in the past. She kissed him again, pouring all her own uncertainty and growing feelings into the connection between them. Whatever happened next, whatever dangers they faced, she was no longer just a reminder of what he'd lost. She was Era Kim, and she was worth loving for herself. Miles away in Seoul, in offices and warehouses controlled by rival families, other conversations were taking place. Conversations about the woman who had brought music back into Dante Moretti's life, and how that music might be permanently silenced. The healing had begun, but so had the countdown to the next act of violence that would test whether their growing love was strong enough to survive the deadly world that surrounded them. Marco Santangelo received the photographs while enjoying his morning espresso on the terrace of his Busan mansion. The images showed Dante Moretti walking through his estate gardens with a beautiful woman, their hands intertwined, their body language speaking of intimate connection and growing attachment. But it was the final photograph that made Marco's blood run cold with possibility. The woman looked exactly like Isabella Moretti. Impossible, Marco breathed, studying the image more closely. He had been present at Isabella's funeral 3 years ago, had watched Dante's soul die along with his wife's body. The resemblance was so perfect it seemed supernatural, as if fate itself was playing some elaborate joke on his longtime rival. His phone rang immediately, the number indicating his most valuable source of information within the Moretti organization. "Tell me about the woman," Marco said without preamble when Roberto Salvatore's voice came through the encrypted connection. "Her name is Era Kim," Roberto replied, his tone carefully neutral despite the enormity of what he was revealing. "She's a cellist who was performing at the charity gala when the Yamamoto hit squad attacked. Dante saved her life and brought her to the estate." "And the resemblance to Isabella?" "It's uncanny," Roberto admitted, "down to the smallest details. When Mrs. Park first saw her, she nearly fainted. Some of the men are calling it a miracle, others think it's a curse." Marco smiled slowly, his mind already calculating the possibilities this unexpected gift presented. After 3 years of careful maneuvering, of testing Dante's defenses and waiting for the perfect opportunity, fate had delivered exactly what he needed to destroy his enemy once and for all. "How attached is he to this woman?" Marco asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Completely," Roberto said. "He's had the entire estate's security upgraded, tripled the guard rotations, and started playing piano again for the first time since Isabella died. Yesterday, I heard him humming while reviewing shipping manifests. The transformation is remarkable and dangerous," Marco observed. "A man in love is a man with vulnerabilities." 3 hours later, the first attempt on Era's life was subtle enough to pass for coincidence. She was walking with Mrs. Park through the estate's rose garden when a section of ancient stone wall suddenly collapsed, sending massive blocks crashing down exactly where she had been standing moments before. Only Mrs. Park's quick reflexes, pulling Era backward just as the stones began to fall, saved her from being crushed beneath tons of century-old masonry. Dante arrived within minutes, his face white with terror as he surveyed the destruction. The wall had stood for over 100 years without incident, had survived earthquakes and storms and the gradual settling of the estate's foundations. Its sudden collapse in the exact moment Era walked past was either the most improbable accident in history or something far more sinister. "This wasn't chance," Dante said grimly as his security team examined the collapsed stones. "Someone weakened the mortar, created stress fractures that would fail at precisely the right moment." Roberto nodded gravely, though privately he was impressed by Marco's planning. The timing had been perfect, close enough to genuine danger to terrify Dante, while leaving enough room for rescue to avoid actually eliminating their most valuable asset. "Sir," Roberto said carefully, "perhaps we should consider moving Miss Kim to a more secure location. Somewhere away from the estate where she might be less exposed." "No," Dante replied immediately, his arm moving protectively around Era's shoulders. "She stays with me where I can protect her personally. Double the perimeter guards and sweep every inch of the estate for additional threats." As his men scattered to implement the new security protocols, Era pulled Dante aside to voice the concern that had been growing in her heart since she first learned about the dangerous world he inhabited. "This is my fault," she said quietly, her voice thick with guilt and fear. "My being here has made you a target in ways you weren't before. They're using me to get to you. They're using everything they can find to get to me," Dante corrected, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "That's the nature of this business, the reality I've lived with my entire adult life. The only difference now is that I have something worth protecting again. But if I left, if I went back to Seoul or disappeared entirely, you'd be safe," Era insisted. "Your empire wouldn't be threatened by enemies trying to exploit your feelings for me." Dante's response was a kiss so fierce and desperate it left her breathless, a physical declaration that words could never adequately express. When they separated, his dark eyes burned with an intensity that made her heart race. I lived safely for 3 years after Isabella died, he said. Safe and empty and dead inside. I won't go back to that existence, not even to protect myself from every enemy in Asia. The second attempt came during dinner 3 nights later. Poison in the wine that would have killed her if Dante's food taster hadn't collapsed convulsing before the first course was served. The third was a sniper's bullet that shattered the music room window where she practiced every afternoon, missing her by inches only because she had bent to retrieve dropped sheet music at the crucial moment. After each attack, security grew tighter and Dante's protective instincts became more possessive. He barely left her side, assigned bodyguards to shadow her every movement, and began conducting business from the estate instead of traveling to his sole offices. But it was Roberto who delivered the news that changed everything. I've received an interesting proposition, he announced during their weekly security briefing. The Seoul Children's Hospital has requested that Miss Kim perform at their annual fundraising gala next month. They're offering an extraordinary fee and citing her previous performances as inspiration for the invitation. It's obviously a trap, Lorenzo said immediately. No legitimate organization would extend such an invitation given the current security situation. Actually, Marcus interjected, pulling up files on his tablet, the invitation appears completely legitimate. I've verified the hospital's board members, the event planning committee, even the catering company. Everything checks out as genuine. Dante frowned as he studied the formal invitation, recognizing the hospital's letterhead and the signatures of administrators he had met during previous charitable contributions. The offer was indeed generous, more than Era typically earned in 6 months of private lessons and small venue performances. It's still too dangerous, he concluded. We'll decline politely and make a substantial donation to compensate for the disappointment. But Era surprised everyone by speaking up before Roberto could respond. I want to do it, she said firmly. I want to perform at the gala. The room fell silent as 5 dangerous men stared at the woman who had just announced her intention to walk directly into what everyone suspected was an elaborate death trap. Absolutely not, Dante said immediately. The risks are unacceptable. You could be killed the moment you step onto that stage. I could be killed walking through our own garden, Era replied, gesturing toward the window where afternoon sunlight illuminated the rose beds where she had nearly died. I could be killed eating dinner or practicing cello or sleeping in our bed. If I spend my entire life hiding from potential threats, then I'm not really living at all. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone to confront the impossible choice between safety and freedom, between existence and actual life. This is exactly what they want, Roberto said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made Dante's eyes narrow with sudden suspicion. They want to force you into an emotional decision, want your feelings for Miss Kim to override your strategic judgment. And how would you know what they want, Roberto? Dante asked, his tone deceptively casual as his hand moved closer to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Because I've been feeding them information for the past 6 months, Roberto admitted, his confession stunning everyone in the room except Dante, who had begun to suspect his head of security's loyalty after the third attack's convenient timing. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Lorenzo and Marcus drawing their weapons while Dante remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the man who had betrayed everything he had sworn to protect. Why? Dante asked, the single word carrying 3 years of accumulated rage and disappointment. Because Marco offered me something you never could, Roberto replied, his own hand resting on his weapon though he made no move to draw it. He offered me Isabella's killer. Giovanni Rosselli is in Marco's custody, and he's willing to trade the man who actually pulled the trigger for information about your weaknesses. Era felt the room's temperature drop several degrees as Dante processed this revelation. The man who had orchestrated Isabella's murder, who had destroyed Dante's first chance at happiness, was within reach of the justice that had eluded him for 3 years. You betrayed me for revenge that was rightfully mine, Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough menace to make grown men take involuntary steps backward. I betrayed you for closure, Roberto corrected. You've spent 3 years destroying yourself with grief and rage. I thought that knowing Isabella's killer was finally dead might give you permission to live again. The logic was seductive, the reasoning understandable, but betrayal was still betrayal regardless of the motivation behind it. Dante rose slowly from his chair, his movements predatory and controlled as he approached the man who had once been his most trusted lieutenant. And now Marco knows everything about our defenses, our routines, our vulnerabilities, Dante observed. He knows exactly how much Era means to me and precisely how to use that knowledge as a weapon against us both. Yes, Roberto admitted. The hospital gala is a trap designed to force you into an impossible choice. Attend and risk Era's life in a venue he controls completely, or refuse and watch him systematically eliminate every charitable organization that matters to her until she insists on performing anyway. Dante nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression as he recognized the sophisticated psychological warfare being waged against him. Marco had studied his enemy carefully, had identified the exact pressure points that would force predictable responses regardless of strategic considerations. Then we give him what he expects, Dante said finally, surprising everyone including Era. We attend the gala, we perform exactly as he's planned, and we spring our own trap within his trap. The room erupted into protests from Lorenzo and Marcus, while Roberto remained silent, understanding that his fate had already been decided regardless of the evening's outcome. But it was Era who silenced everyone with her next words. Good, she said firmly, meeting Dante's eyes with determination that matched his own. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people's hatred control my choices. If Marco wants a performance, let's give him one he'll never forget. In that moment, watching the woman he loved choose courage over safety, Dante knew that whatever happened at the gala, they would face it together. The trap was set, the players were in position, and the final act of their deadly symphony was about to begin. The Soul Children's Hospital Gala was the most elegant death trap Era had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables draped in pristine white linens, while Soul's most influential families mingled beneath towering arrangements of white roses and baby's breath. The ballroom could have been twin to the venue where she first met Dante. Except tonight she understood exactly what kind of predators hid behind the expensive suits and practiced smiles. Era sat in the performer's waiting area, her hands steady as she rosined her bow despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Through the partially open door, she could see the guests taking their seats, their conversations a low murmur that would soon be replaced by something far more violent. Dante appeared in the doorway, magnificent in his black tuxedo, but with eyes that held the cold focus of a man preparing for war. Behind him stood Lorenzo and Marcus, both armed and alert despite their formal attire. Last chance to change your mind, Dante said quietly, though they both knew retreat was no longer an option. Marco's men have been positioning themselves throughout the building for the past hour. Roberto's intelligence was thorough. Where is Roberto now? Era asked, adjusting her cello's tuning pegs with practiced precision. Being held in our secure location until this is over, Lorenzo answered grimly. His fate depends on whether his information proves accurate and whether we all survive the evening. Dante knelt beside Era's chair, his hands covering hers as she gripped her bow. When the shooting starts, you keep playing, he said, his voice intense but loving. No matter what happens around you, you focus on the music. It's the one thing that will keep you centered, keep you safe. And what about keeping you safe? Era replied, studying his face for any sign of the fear she knew he had to be feeling. I've been preparing for nights like this my entire life, Dante said, pressing a quick kiss to her forehead. But I've never had a reason to survive them until now. The master of ceremonies introduced her with flowery praise for her musical accomplishments and charitable spirit, completely unaware that he was announcing the opening movement of a deadly symphony. Era walked onto the stage carrying her cello, her emerald green dress flowing around her like water as she took her position center stage. The audience applauded politely, but she could see the tension in their faces, the way certain guests checked their watches and shifted nervously in their seats. Marco's people were scattered throughout the crowd, waiting for their signal, while legitimate donors sat unknowingly in the crossfire. Era began with Elgar's cello concerto in E minor, the haunting melody that had always reminded her of love tested by impossible circumstances. The first movement flowed from her fingers like liquid emotion, filling the ballroom with music so beautiful it seemed to transcend the violence everyone knew was coming. She spotted Marco Santangelo in the third row, a handsome man in his 50s who watched her with the satisfied expression of a hunter whose trap had been perfectly executed. His men were positioned at every exit. Their formal were unable to completely conceal the weapons they carried. That was when Dante made his entrance. The ballroom's rear doors exploded inward as Dante's soldiers poured into the elegant space with military precision. Their black tactical gear and assault weapons transformed the charity gala into a battlefield in seconds, sending guests screaming and diving under tables as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. But Era kept playing. The Elgar continued to soar above the chaos, her cello's voice pure and strong as bullets shattered windows and sent chunks of plaster raining down from the ornate ceiling. She had promised Dante she would focus on the music, and she discovered that the concentration required to maintain perfect intonation and timing actually did keep her centered despite the violence exploding around her. Marco's men returned fire from their concealed positions throughout the ballroom, turning elegant dinner tables into defensive barricades as they fought Dante's assault team. Crystal glasses exploded and silverware scattered as automatic weapons fire raked across the room. Dante moved through the chaos like an avenging angel, his custom pistols speaking with deadly accuracy as he eliminated threats while advancing toward the stage where Era continued her performance. She could see him in her peripheral vision, protecting her even as he waged war against their enemies. The first movement of the concerto ended just as Roberto Salvatore emerged from behind the stage curtains. The former head of security had somehow escaped from Dante's custody, had used his intimate knowledge of their security protocols to infiltrate the venue during the confusion. His face was battered and bloody from interrogation, but his eyes burned with desperate determination as he raised his weapon toward Era. "You destroyed everything," he shouted over the gunfire, his voice breaking with emotion and rage. He was finally healing, finally ready to let Isabella go, and you ruined it all with your selfish need to be protected and cherished. Roberto's first shot went wide as Dante tackled him from the side, sending both men crashing into the grand piano in a tangle of violence and fury. They fought with the desperate savagery of former allies turned enemies, each knowing that only one would walk away from the encounter. Era began the second movement of the Elgar, the music becoming her anchor as she watched the two most important men in Dante's organization try to kill each other mere feet from where she sat. The cello sang of loss and redemption while gunfire provided a brutal percussion accompaniment. That was when Marco made his move. The enemy boss had used the distraction of Roberto's attack to circle around behind the stage, approaching Era from her blind spot, while Dante was engaged with his former lieutenant. Marco's arm snaked around her throat before she could react, the cold metal of his pistol pressing against her temple as he pulled her upright. "Enough," Marco shouted, his voice carrying clearly over the gunfire that immediately ceased as both sides recognized the hostage situation. Everyone freezes, or the beautiful musician dies. Dante looked up from where he had pinned Roberto to the floor, his face going white with terror as he saw Era trapped in Marco's grip. Around the ballroom, his soldiers held their positions but lowered their weapons, understanding that any aggressive movement would result in her death. "3 years ago you cost me everything when you killed my brother in that territory dispute," Marco said, his voice conversational despite the chaos surrounding them. "Tonight you're going to know exactly how that loss feels." Dante rose slowly to his feet, his hands visible and empty as he faced the man who held the woman he loved. Behind him, Roberto remained motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head from injuries sustained in their fight. "What do you want, Marco?" Dante asked, though they both knew the answer. "I want you to choose," Marco replied, pressing the gun harder against Era's temple until she winced with pain. "Your empire or her life? Your soldiers lay down their weapons and surrender, or I put a bullet through her beautiful brain." Era could feel the tremor in Marco's hand, could smell the cologne and desperation radiating from the man who held her life in his trigger finger. But what she noticed most was the way Dante's face transformed as he processed the ultimatum. For 3 years, he had built his identity around being the most feared crime boss in Seoul, had accumulated power and wealth and influence beyond most people's dreams. His empire employed thousands, controlled billions in legitimate and illegitimate revenue, and represented the life's work of generations of Moretti men. But watching him look at her, Era saw the exact moment when Dante chose love over legacy. "Stand down," he ordered his soldiers, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. All weapons on the ground, hands visible. His men hesitated, understanding that following this order meant the end of everything they had built together. But Dante's authority was absolute, and one by one they began placing their weapons on the floor. Marco smiled in triumph, but his victory was short-lived. As the last weapon clattered to the marble floor, Era did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She resumed playing her cello. The third movement of the Elgar burst from her instrument with fierce intensity, the music so powerful and unexpected that Marco's attention wavered for just a moment. That moment was all Dante needed. He moved with the speed and precision of a man who had nothing left to lose, crossing the distance between them before Marco could react. The enemy boss's shot went wild as Dante's tackle sent them all crashing to the stage, Era rolling away as the two men fought for control of the weapon. The final gunshot echoed through the ballroom like the closing note of a symphony, followed by silence so complete that everyone could hear Era's ragged breathing as she clutched her cello protectively against her chest. Marco Santangelo lay motionless beside the overturned music stand, Dante's final bullet having found its mark with the same precision he brought to everything else he truly cared about protecting. Dante helped Era to her feet with hands that shook from adrenaline and relief, his arms wrapping around her as if he would never let her go again. Around them, sirens wailed in the distance while his soldiers began the complex process of managing the aftermath of a war fought in front of 200 witnesses. The empire he had inherited from his father, the criminal organization that had defined his identity for 15 years, was finished. Too much had been exposed. Too many bodies lay scattered across the ballroom floor for any return to the shadows. But as Era's music had reminded him in the midst of violence, some things were worth more than power. Some things were worth sacrificing everything to protect. "It's over," he whispered against her hair, and for the first time in 3 years, Dante Moretti felt completely free. 3 months after the hospital gala bloodbath, Era performed her final note at the Harmony Café, a small intimate venue in Seoul's University District where music lovers gathered to hear emerging artists. The audience of 30 people applauded enthusiastically as she finished Pachelbel's Canon in D, their appreciation genuine and warm in a way that no elite charity gala could ever match. She had traded crystal chandeliers for exposed brick walls, designer gowns for simple sundresses, and audiences of Seoul's most powerful for college students and young professionals who saved money all week to afford the modest cover charge. But as she packed her cello after the performance, Era had never felt more fulfilled as a musician. The transition hadn't been easy. The media storm following the hospital massacre had made both their faces internationally recognizable, turning them into symbols of a love story that had toppled one of Asia's most powerful crime families. Dante's testimony against Marco's surviving lieutenants had sent dozens of criminals to prison, while his cooperation with prosecutors had dismantled trafficking networks across 3 countries. But testimony came with consequences. The Moretti Empire was finished, its assets seized or liquidated, its territory redistributed among rival organizations. Dante had surrendered 15 years of accumulated power and wealth, walking away from a criminal inheritance worth billions to build something new with the woman whose music had saved his soul. They lived now in a modest apartment overlooking Han River, its 2 bedrooms furnished with pieces Era had chosen from catalogs rather than items stolen or purchased with blood money. Dante had kept enough legitimate investments to ensure their comfort, but their new life was measured in shared meals and quiet evenings rather than private jets and bulletproof limousines. He was waiting for her outside the cafe when her performance ended, leaning against their second-hand Honda with a bouquet of daisies that had cost less than the champagne he used to drink with breakfast. The sight of him in casual clothes still sometimes caught her off guard. This man who had once commanded armies now content to drive her to gigs and carry her cello case. "How did it feel tonight?" he asked as they loaded her instrument into the car, his voice carrying genuine interest in her artistic experience rather than concern for security threats or rival surveillance. "Perfect," Era replied, and meant it completely. The acoustics were beautiful, the audience was engaged, and I played pieces I chose because I loved them rather than because they impressed wealthy donors. During the drive home, Dante shared news about the music education program he had been developing with his remaining legitimate funds. The Moretti Foundation would provide free instruments and lessons to underprivileged children throughout Seoul, turning former safe houses and money laundering fronts into community centers where kids could discover the transformative power of music. "We received approval for the Gangnam location today," he said as they stopped at a red light. "The building where Lorenzo used to coordinate shipping operations will become a full conservatory by next spring." "Isabella would have loved that," Era said softly, no longer feeling jealous when his first wife's memory entered their conversations. Over the past months, she had come to understand that honoring Isabella's legacy was part of loving Dante completely, accepting all the experiences that had shaped him into the man worth saving. "She would have," Dante agreed, reaching over to squeeze Era's hand. "But this is our project, built with our values and our hopes for the future. Isabella's memory inspired it, but you're making it real." The next morning brought an unexpected request that tested how completely they had both moved beyond their violent past. Mrs. Park called to inform them that the caretakers at Seoul Memorial Cemetery had been asking about Isabella's gravesite, which had been neglected since Dante's exile from the criminal world. "I should visit her," Dante said after ending the call, his voice carrying an uncertainty that Era recognized as fear rather than reluctance. "I haven't been there since the day we buried her. I was afraid that seeing her grave would make me want to go back to the man I was before you taught me how to live again." "I'll come with you," Era offered, the words surprising them both. "If you're ready to say goodbye properly, then we should do it together." They drove to the cemetery on a crisp autumn morning when golden leaves carpeted the pathways between ornate headstones and memorial gardens. Isabella's grave was located in the most expensive section, beneath a marble angel that had cost more than most families earned in a year. The flowers Dante had arranged to be delivered weekly for 3 years had stopped coming after his empire fell, leaving the gravesite looking abandoned and forgotten. Weeds grew between the marble stones while Isabella's photograph, sealed behind glass, looked out at a world that had moved beyond the love story that had once defined it. Dante knelt beside the headstone and began clearing away the debris, his movements gentle and reverent as he restored order to the sacred space. Era assembled her cello nearby, understanding without being told what this moment required. She began to play the violin piece that had been Isabella's favorite, the composition Dante had performed for her in the shrine room months ago. But now she interpreted it on cello, her own voice joining the melody that connected past and present, honoring what had been while celebrating what was becoming. When the music ended, Dante spoke to Isabella's photograph with words that carried 3 years of accumulated grief finally finding resolution. "I loved you with everything I had," he said quietly. "You saved me from becoming a monster, taught me that power could be gentle and strength could be tender. I will always be grateful for the years we had together." He paused, gathering courage for words that would change everything between them, between him and the woman who lay buried beneath autumn leaves and morning sunlight. "But I can't live in our past anymore, Isabella. I've found someone who makes me want to build a future instead of just preserving memories. Someone whose music reaches the parts of my heart that have learned to heal instead of just surviving." Era continued playing softly, providing a musical foundation for Dante's goodbye that honored both women without diminishing either. "I'm going to ask her to marry me," Dante continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not because she looks like you, but because she's brave enough to create something new from the wreckage of everything I used to be. I think you would like her, Isabella. I think you would approve of the man she's helping me become." The cemetery fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond. For the first time since Isabella's death, Dante felt her presence as a blessing rather than a burden, a gentle approval that gave him permission to love again without guilt or reservation. That evening, as they sat in Isabella's music room at the estate which Dante had managed to keep through careful legal maneuvering, he proposed with words that came from a heart finally free of the past. "Marry me, Era Kim," he said as she finished practicing a piece by Brahms. "Not because you remind me of someone I lost, but because you showed me how to find myself again." Because your music doesn't just heal old wounds, it creates new possibilities. The ring he offered was simple, elegant, nothing like the massive diamond he had given Isabella, but perfect for the woman Era had chosen to become. As she said yes, they both understood they were choosing each other completely, without reservations or comparisons or the weight of ghosts. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in the same music room where they had first kissed, surrounded by Lorenzo and Marcus and the few friends who had survived the transition from their old life to their new one. Mrs. Park cried during the ceremony, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief as she watched two people who had found love among the ruins of violence and betrayal. Era played her cello during their first dance as married couple, the melody flowing around them like a promise that music would always be the language of their love. Dante accompanied her on piano, their instruments creating harmony that spoke of two distinct voices joining to create something neither could achieve alone. As they danced and played, Era thought about all of you watching their story unfold, wondered about the role music played in your own relationships and the sacrifices you might make for someone you truly loved. What songs define your most important connections? She mused as her bow drew emotion from the strings. What would you be willing to give up to protect the person who makes your heart sing? Love asks impossible things of us sometimes, but the music it creates makes every sacrifice worthwhile. The reception was small, intimate, filled with laughter and tears and hope for the future they would build together. Former enemies had become friends, violence had transformed into peace, and two broken people had discovered they could create something beautiful from the fragments of their separate pains. 6 months later, as Seoul winter gave way to spring, Era sat in the music room playing a lullaby she had composed for their unborn child. Her pregnancy showed as a gentle curve beneath her flowing dress, physical proof of the new life they had created from love rather than inheritance or arrangement. Dante listened from his chair across the room, his face peaceful in a way that would have been impossible before music taught him how to heal. His hands rested on the book of children's songs he had been reading, preparing to be the kind of father Isabella would have wanted him to become and Era deserved him to be. The cello sang its gentle melody while afternoon sunlight painted golden rectangles across the marble floor, the same room where Isabella had once played violin now filled with music that looked toward tomorrow instead of yesterday. Their child would grow up surrounded by beauty instead of violence, protected by love that had conquered the darkness both parents had known. As the lullaby reached its conclusion, Dante rose and moved to sit beside Era's chair, his hand covering the place where their baby grew safely beneath her heart. Together, they had created a symphony from the chaos of their separate lives, proving that some kinds of music were powerful enough to transform even the most broken instruments into something capable of perfect harmony. The love that had begun with blood on a white dress and bullets in a ballroom had become this, quiet and strong and infinitely precious. Music had brought them together, music had healed their wounds, and music would guide their child into a world where beauty mattered more than power and love conquered every enemy that dared to threaten it. In the distance, the city hummed with its eternal rhythms of ambition and desire, but in the circular music room overlooking gardens where roses bloomed without fear, two hearts beat in perfect time to a melody that would last forever.